education with elections and electioneering that you see, leave aside COVID, in general, how do parties approach this question, or the electorate that's interested in education?
I think it's a fantastic question, and it has multiple facets. I think there isn't a simple answer like it doesn't get votes. It's not just reductive, but it's entirely wrong. The reason I say that is, if you look at it historically in India, let's take the example of a state like Tamil Nadu. You have had the entire noon meal scheme, come out of that state and, dominate the country, so to speak, which is one of the key reasons literacy rates went up, right? The literacy accomplishments in Tamil Nadu and many of the neighboring states that initially borrowed it and then it became a nationwide thing can directly be attributed to the midday meal scheme. The ICDS as a program, early learning, also has contributed towards this. While we don't invest as much in actual learning and, we invest a lot in health, in India, a lot of learning is impeded by the lack of health, both maternal health and child health, due to the excesses in both paucity of women's health and in increase in malnutrition and stunting and things like that. So just these measures, I think, have contributed a lot towards education, and it's a matter of how it has been pitched or not pitched. I think one of the biggest failures of welfare politics at a national level, I want to contrast it with welfare politics at a state level, where states like Andhra or Tamil Nadu have been extraordinarily successful at capitalizing on welfare politics. Whereas at a national level, the Congress really, which has been the sort of bastion of welfare politics, hasn't capitalized, whether it is on MNREGA or on ICDS or on, several of these schemes that they've brought in. So I think we should separate the fact that some political parties have failed to capitalize on this from whether people really want it or whether it has electoral outcomes, right? Whether it has electoral currency, so to speak. That is one aspect of things, I think. The notion that it doesn't have electoral currency is something I totally disregard. And more recently, of course, as you know, AAP has spoken a lot about public education and has won elections basis that. And while they might like to think that they're the only ones doing it, no, it has been done for decades in many states, including Kerala, including Tamil Nadu, including Andhra, where public education, especially with both Kamaraj and MGR and Karunanidhi as well. Public education was the mantle upon which some of these elections were won. So it is not true, that education is not winnable as an election focus. It is very much so, and it has changed governments dramatically as a result of it. Now, that said, I think there is an aspect to timing, like you rightly pointed out. Timing, and I'm including sort of events that overtake us as forcing a political agenda that otherwise could have been set. For example, you take an India against corruption, it sets a certain agenda to which now parties either capitalize or respond, and everything else gets dwarfed, which is why the first run of AAP, for example, was based on an anti-corruption, whereas the second run, they emphasized much more on a public education. Similarly, the first run of the Dravidian parties was on social justice, and then they were able to bring in the education agenda 20 years later. So now if you look at it in the shadow of COVID, like you've rightly pointed out, access to education everywhere, you see it in all manifestos, in terms of access to internet, access to tablets, access to 3G, 4G data cards so that they can actually access education. So sometimes events overtake us, whether they are political events or otherwise. In this case, it's a pandemic. I gave the example of an anti-corruption. You can take an example of highly polarized communal agenda, which ends up taking all the focus of the election and away from, certain other much more nuanced things. It becomes difficult. So I think we can't naysay that. You have to consider that in how the agenda is set, which goes back to why in certain states, when you have a dual party mode, it does exceedingly well. This is worldwide established. The combination of especially welfare politics plus a two-party system ends up giving extraordinary outcomes on the HDIs, on health, education, and so forth, right? Even employment. So Kerala is in that mode, Tamil Nadu is in that mode. To some extent, Andhra was in that mode, and you've seen the delta over the decades. You have two parties playing welfare politics, and then it's a dual party kind of a back and forth,
Right.
which is very difficult when you have a disruptive electoral player come in and talk about something completely different, whatever that may be, right?
Okay, so yesterday I spoke to this IPAC person who was talking about their work with TMC in Bengal. And he was saying, look, some constituencies matter because in Bengal we have typically well-educated contestants running from them, and so we need to plank on education. But some constituencies, it doesn't matter at all. So there is some agenda setting and some strategization that goes on by the parties. How does this work, and how can we fit in, or where does learning outcomes ever feature in some sort of agenda setting like this, even at a local level with regional politics?
Agenda setting, in a lot of ways, whether you're doing it proactively or whether you're on the back foot, in some ways even determines electoral outcomes, right? She who has the loudest complaining voice ends up sort of capturing the media space and public imagination. Absolutely. And that voice is much easier if it's an anti-establishment voice. It's difficult for a pro-establishment voice.
Unless you do like national security or fear-mongering.
Correct, which is why they fall back to 2 or 3 typical things like national security, like polarization on communal fronts and so forth. But there have been really good examples of government agenda setting, which is the midday meal scheme itself. Like I had said, the MNREGA itself is a fantastic agenda setting, but it was never capitalized in the case of NREGA electorally, right? Now, back to your question, if you look at, for example, right now in Tamil Nadu, the opposition is doing a reasonably good job of agenda setting. A lot of the times, opposition does agenda setting, taking off from what the citizens are upset about, right? For example, the firings in Thoothukudi, the anti-NEET, the anti-NEP sentiment, which brings us back to education. So quality of education can also be accomplished. If you look at even the BJP and how they've pitched the quality of education, it has been through an NEP, right? Whether you agree with the NEP or not is secondary. The point is what they are trying to attack is the quality of education. Right. So it isn't entirely right to say that quality of education, if it cannot be an electoral issue. I think we have proved that is not true. Repeatedly in India, it has been even a winning plank, provided you know how to capitalize on it.
Right.
B, it is not true to say that if it is not an electoral issue, it doesn't become a key agenda item. Because again, even when AAP won with India Against Corruption, they did make public education a key agenda item. MGR won on however he won, but midday meal scheme and education became their defining thing, his legacy, in fact, for the entire country. And then if you look at the BJP now, the NEP has become a key part of their agenda. Education can be an agenda. It may not be the main agenda, a key agenda, even after elections. And many times, that is how it ends up being. If you look at George Bush and No Child Left Behind, or Obama's initiatives on education, right? It's not a quality issue, it's a quantity issue oftentimes, right? But the point is that why should it be an electoral issue? It can, and we have proved that there are times that it is an electoral issue, key enough issue to drive an election. But there are also times when it becomes a key agenda without being an electoral issue. Right. And so long as the governance is lending its putting its strength behind it, lending its might to it and prioritizing it. I mean, you can't vote on everything, right? I mean, the vote is an emotional thing and there are only so many issues that you can spearhead.